Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
I didn't even cry. That's the part that sticks with me the most. How empty I felt the second I crossed that finish line. Not because I'd finally done it, not because I was the state champion after years of running like hell, but because I already knew what I'd see when I looked up into the bleachers. And I was right. The crowd was huge, screaming, standing, clapping, but my section, my family's section, was empty. Not one face I recognized. Not a banner. Not a cheap folding chair with my name scribbled on poster board. Nothing. And I think I laughed, honestly. Just a sharp, bitter exhale through my nose because it was so predictable. It didn't hurt like a fresh wound. It was the kind of pain that had built up like layers of sediment over the years, hard, compact, familiar. You don't just wake up angry. You grow into it like an old shoe. It stretches around your foot, adapts to your shape, becomes part of how you move. My anger was like that, quiet, patient, never too loud, but always there. I grew up in a house where silence meant comfort, and comfort meant we were all pretending not to notice who Dad actually loved more. My brother Josh, 2 years older, golden from the moment he took his first breath, could have burned the whole damn house down and still gotten a pat on the back for keeping the fire warm. Me? If I breathed wrong at the dinner table, my dad would click his tongue and mutter something about attitude. He wasn't cruel in the way some dads are, no belt, no shouting fits, no holes punched through drywall. He was worse. He was selective. And when you're a little girl trying to matter, silence can be louder than a scream. He showed up for every one of Josh's games. Football, baseball, wrestling, didn't matter if it was raining sideways or if Josh had the flu. My dad was there, in the front row, pacing the sidelines like a coach who forgot he wasn't on the payroll. And afterward? Steaks, beer for him, Sprite for Josh, the smell of celebration soaking into the walls of every restaurant in town. But when I made the varsity track team as a sophomore, you know what my dad said? Well, running in circles ain't much of a sport, but good for you. That was it. No steak. No Sprite. No front row seat. I remember standing there, gripping my cleats in one hand, backpack on the other shoulder, trying not to let my face give away the sting. My mom smiled faintly like she always did, trying to smooth the moment over with some half-hearted, "We're proud of you, sweetie," but I didn't need her pity. I needed someone to look me in the eye and say, "I saw what you did and it meant something." But no one ever did. Not at home, anyway. Josh went on to play college ball, of course. Never finished his degree, dropped out after 2 years, then came back to town acting like a veteran who'd done his duty. Dad still bragged about him, though. Still told strangers at the gas station, my boy could have gone pro if his knee hadn't given out. They never mentioned that the knee gave out because he was drunk driving his buddy's truck into a ditch after a keg party. That part of the story somehow always got skipped. And me? I kept running. Track wasn't therapy. It wasn't some poetic outlet. It was war. Every step I took on that black rubber track was another middle finger to the silence. I didn't care about medals or college scouts or recognition. I just wanted to be undeniable. I wanted to run so fast they couldn't ignore me, even if they wanted to. I ran before school, after school, even on weekends when the air was too cold to breathe. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, my shoes wore down to the foam, but I never stopped. Because I wasn't running toward anything. I was running away from that feeling, the one you get when you walk into your own living room and realize no one's asking how your day was. Coach D saw something in me, I think. She never said it outright, but she stayed late at practice and never once called me Josh's little sister. That alone made her feel like a lighthouse in a storm. But she didn't pry. She didn't ask about my family. She just handed me water and said, "Run it again." And I did. Every damn time. Not because I liked her, but because she didn't treat me like a background character in someone else's story. By the time I was a senior, I was setting records, blowing past competition like they were standing still. And yet, no one came. Not once. My mom had excuses, work, errands, not feeling well. My dad didn't even bother lying. Just said, "Josh's kids are over this weekend." Like that was supposed to explain everything. Like I was supposed to understand that my niece's piano recital took priority over my biggest race of the year. I didn't argue. What was the point? I just nodded, tied my laces, and promised myself I'd never let any of them act surprised when I made it. So when I stood on that podium at the state championship, clutching the heavy gold trophy in one hand and the mic in the other, I didn't hesitate. I didn't choke. I said what had been sitting in the back of my throat since I was 9 years old and got a B+ in math while Josh brought home a C and still got pizza. I said it with no tears, no shaking voice, just cold, steady truth. Nobody came to see me win this. So imagine what I could have done with support. And the crowd? The room roared. People jumped to their feet. Some even cried. I saw a woman in the third row mouth the words, "Oh my God," like I had just cracked open something inside her. Phones were out. Cameras flashing. Strangers clapping like they'd known me for years. But none of that mattered. I didn't say it for them. I said it for the man who suddenly couldn't stop calling. My father, Robert Thomas, who had spent the last 3 decades pretending I was fine in the background of Josh's spotlight. He had no idea what to do with the truth. But now it was out there. I was undeniable. And for the first time in my life, I knew I had his full, undivided attention. And I had no intention of answering his call. Not yet. Because this time, he could sit in silence. Let it burn. Just like I did. The thing most people misunderstand about athletes, especially the quiet ones, the ones who never throw their arms up when they cross the finish line, the ones who don't scream or fist pump or post their mile times on Instagram, is that not all of us do this because we love it. Some of us do it because there's nowhere else to put the anger, because therapy is expensive and talking doesn't fix a damn thing when the people you want to hear you have already tuned you out. For me, running wasn't some metaphor for freedom or a poetic journey toward inner peace. It was punishment, and not in the cliché, motivational poster kind of way, but in the most literal sense possible. It hurt. It burned. It stripped the muscles from my legs and left my lungs raw. It took me apart, piece by piece, and still I kept going, not because I was trying to be the best, but because I was trying to bury the version of me that once waited in the front yard for her dad to come home and say he was proud. I started track in 9th grade, mostly because I knew I wouldn't have to talk to anyone, and I didn't need anyone's help to get better. You can't fake a 400. You can't charm your way through a time trial. There's no team to hide behind. No quarterback to steal the praise. It's you, the stopwatch, and the pain. And I liked that, even when I hated it. I liked that if I lost, it was my fault, and if I won, no one could say it was luck or politics or favoritism. The stopwatch didn't care that I was a girl, or that my dad thought track was a hobby for bored housewives. It just ticked mercilessly and told the truth every time. Coach D saw me run during gym class once, just one lap around the football field, nothing special, and called me over like I'd stolen something. She didn't smile, didn't praise, just looked me in the eye and asked why I wasn't already on the team. I shrugged, said something about not having time, and she said, "That's bullshit," which stunned me into silence, because no adult had ever spoken to me that plainly. She told me practice started at 3:30 and that if I had any sense, I'd show up and stop wasting what God apparently gave me. I did show up, but not because of God. I didn't think I had a gift. I didn't think I was special. I just didn't want to go home and sit across from my dad while he asked Josh about his lifting stats like I didn't exist. The early days were brutal. My shins felt like they were splintering from the inside. My hamstrings stayed tight no matter how long I stretched. I puked behind the bleachers twice before anyone noticed. But Coach D didn't baby me. She nodded when I stumbled past her and said, "Good. That's how you know you're doing it right." There was something strangely comforting in how little she cared about anything other than the work. She didn't ask about my life. She didn't try to be a second mother. She just timed my runs and raised an eyebrow every time I beat my previous record, like it was interesting but not impressive. That kind of indifference became addictive. It meant I didn't have to pretend. I could just run, breathe, collapse, and get up again. At home, nothing changed. My dad still spent most evenings in front of the TV with Josh, watching old game tapes and grumbling about how the local high school coach had no idea how to build a defense. My mom still floated around like a ghost with a clipboard, asking if I'd done my homework, never asking how I felt, never even noticing when I limped in with ice bags duct taped to my knees. And Josh, well, Josh had peaked early and didn't know it yet. He walked around like he still had scouts coming to games, like the college dropout thing was just a bump in the road. He'd slap me on the back sometimes and call me Speedy, but I could tell he didn't think I was actually good. He thought I was playing dress-up in a sport that didn't matter. I won my first meet sophomore year. Nobody was there. No one called. I brought the medal home in my backpack and left it on the kitchen counter like a forgotten receipt, just to see if anyone would say anything. 3 days passed before my mom moved it to the drawer where we kept expired coupons and instruction manuals for appliances we no longer owned. My dad never mentioned it. Josh definitely didn't. And so I made a quiet promise to myself, not to win, not to prove anything, but to outlast them. To keep showing up, grinding, bleeding, until I became something so solid they couldn't ignore me, even if they tried. Coach D started giving me extra reps, not out of kindness, but because she knew I could take it. And I did. I trained through flu season. Through blisters so bad I had to cut the heels off my socks. Through days when I couldn't eat because I felt so invisible I wasn't sure I existed. But I kept going. Because every race I ran was another page I tore out of the story they'd written for me, a quiet girl, not special, not needed, not noticed. I was rewriting it one painful mile at a time. By junior year, I was winning most of my heats. Colleges started sending letters, and Coach D handed them to me like bills I needed to pay. No ceremony. No excitement. Just the facts. "They're watching," she said once, and I nodded, because I knew exactly who wasn't. And maybe that's when the idea started forming, not revenge exactly, but something adjacent. I didn't want to punish them. I just wanted to let them see, clearly and without interruption, what they'd missed while they were too busy cheering for the wrong child. That spring, I qualified for state. Coach D clapped once, sharply, and then handed me a schedule with training dates. No congratulations. No hug. Just the work. And I loved her for it. Because unlike everyone else, she didn't need me to be her daughter or her prodigy. She just needed me to run, and to keep running. The day I got the letter, I told my mom over breakfast. She smiled faintly, said, "That's great, honey," and then asked if I could pick up milk on the way home from practice. My dad didn't even look up from his coffee. Josh wasn't there. Probably nursing a hangover. I looked at the calendar, saw the state meet was scheduled for a Saturday. I knew what that meant. Josh's kids would probably have soccer or dance or whatever distractions my father preferred to celebrate. I didn't bother asking if anyone was coming. Because by then I knew the answer. And I didn't need it said out loud to feel the sting of it. But what they didn't know, what they could never have guessed, is that every step I ran on that track from that day forward wasn't for victory. It was for silence. Theirs. Mine. The kind I planned to break in the most public, unforgettable way possible. And when I did, no one would be able to pretend they hadn't heard it. There is a moment, split second, sharp, hollow, when you look up from the starting blocks and realize that the one thing you pretended not to care about, the one thing you told yourself over and over again didn't matter, suddenly matters more than anything else in the world, and the sheer emptiness of it hits you in a way no victory ever can. I felt it before the race even started, not because I'd expected something different, but because even lies you repeat often enough to survive eventually start to crack under the weight of truth, and the truth that day was so goddamn plain it burned. I scanned the bleachers slowly, row by row, knowing full well I wouldn't find what I was looking for, and yet still hoping, stupidly, that maybe, just maybe, someone had changed their mind, gotten in the car, made the drive, bought the ticket, and decided I was worth watching. But the seats were just plastic and metal, and the cheering voices were for other girls, girls with parents in school sweatshirts and siblings waving handmade signs, girls who weren't racing to prove they mattered, but racing because they already knew they did. I tightened the laces on my spikes so hard my fingers turned white, stood up slowly, and stared straight ahead at the empty stretch of track in front of me like it was a long hallway in a house I'd lived in all my life, but had never once felt at home in. There were photographers on the sidelines, reporters with notepads and cameras, spectators chattering and leaning forward, buzzing with the kind of electric tension that fills the air right before a record gets broken. Coach D gave me one sharp nod from the edge of the infield, nothing dramatic, just a sliver of recognition that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. But even she didn't speak. She knew better. She knew this wasn't about coaching anymore. This was about the 1,000-mile stare in my eyes and the bruises no one ever saw because they weren't on my skin. When the starter raised his pistol, the crowd quieted like a collective breath had been held, and in that half second before the gun cracked through the air, I let go of everything, every insult disguised as a joke, every ignored birthday. Every moment at the dinner table where I waited to be asked about my day and was instead forced to listen to Josh talk about a dream he had where he was back in uniform, winning fake trophies in his sleep. The gun fired, and I exploded off the line, not like I was chasing something, but like I was being chased by the past. I ran with a rage that had simmered for over a decade, a pace that felt like punishment and liberation in the same breath, and as the curve straightened into the final 100 meters, I knew I had already won. It wasn't even close. The others were fast, hungry, but they weren't angry in the same way. They didn't have years of emotional debris fueling every stride. They weren't trying to outrun the echo of an empty childhood. I crossed the finish line with a lead so wide the second-place girl hadn't even hit the final 10 meters. The crowd erupted like they'd been waiting for it, but I didn't raise my arms or smile or look for anyone. I bent forward, hands on my knees, heart pounding so loud I couldn't hear anything except the roar of blood behind my ears. Then I stood, slowly, turned to face the crowd, and looked up once more, one final search for someone who never came. Still nothing. The announcer's voice rang through the stadium speakers, triumphant and full of fake enthusiasm. "Ladies and gentlemen, your state champion in the 400-meter dash, Claire Thomas." People clapped. Strangers. Strangers clapped. Some even stood. I walked to the podium in silence, letting the moment wash over me not like a wave of pride, but like cold water on a wound I'd stopped pretending wasn't there. They handed me the trophy, gold-plated, heavy, shiny in the sun, and told me to smile for the camera. I held it up like I'd been taught to, like I'd seen Josh do in photo after photo framed on our living room wall, and when they offered me the microphone for the post-race interview, something inside me snapped into place like a key turning in a long-forgotten lock. I took the mic, didn't clear my throat, didn't prepare a speech, didn't even pause to think. I looked directly into the crowd, eyes steady, voice sharp and unwavering, and said, "Nobody came to see me win this. So imagine what I could have done with support." And for the first time in my entire life, the room, the entire goddamn stadium, belonged to me. There was a second of stunned silence, the kind that crackles with electricity, like the second before thunder, and then it happened, the eruption. The place came unglued. People stood. People shouted. People clapped like I had just set the world on fire with nothing but my words, and in that moment, I realized that I hadn't just won a race, I had reclaimed a lifetime of being invisible. Phones were out. People were recording, posting, sharing. I saw a woman wiping tears from her face, nodding like she understood, like maybe she had once stood in my shoes or watched her own daughter be ignored. I saw a man in a ball cap clapping with a kind of stunned admiration, like he'd never considered that a girl could be both soft-spoken and devastating at the same time. And Coach D? She didn't clap. She just smiled, the faintest pull at the corner of her mouth, and gave me that same sharp nod. She knew exactly what I'd just done. When I walked off the field, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I felt it. The shift. The weight of years finally beginning to fall away, not because I'd been forgiven or seen, but because I had stopped waiting for them to care and made the world care instead. And then, just as I reached the locker room, my phone buzzed. Dad. I let it ring once. Twice. 3 times. Declined the call. 2 minutes later, it rang again. Same name. Same hollow feeling in my chest. And that was just the beginning. Because after the 3rd call, they started coming faster. Voicemails. Texts. Then one from Josh. Then one from my mother. Suddenly, I wasn't invisible anymore. But I wasn't sure if I liked being seen. The thing about silence is that once it becomes normal, once you get used to the weight of it settling over every conversation, filling the spaces where laughter and questions should be, it starts to feel safer than the alternative. Because the moment someone finally decides to speak, you're forced to remember all the times they didn't, all the chances they had to say something and chose instead to leave the room, close the door, turn up the volume on the television, or worse, look you in the face and say absolutely nothing. That's what made the phone calls feel less like redemption and more like a joke with the punchline delivered 20 years too late. My father, who couldn't be bothered to sit in the stands for a single meet, was now calling me back to back like a man trying to unburn a house with a garden hose. The day after the championship, I woke up to 11 missed calls. 11. All from the same number that, for most of my life, had been reserved for stiff, let me talk to your mother, exchanges, and the occasional birthday voicemail that sounded like it had been left at gunpoint. And now suddenly he was interested, dialing with urgency, probably sitting at the kitchen table in that same chair he used to slump in while Josh recounted his latest high school glory story. Staring at his phone like it might answer back with the version of me he could actually be proud of. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know what the hell I'd say if I did. There's no script for this kind of conversation. No template for what to say to the father who only noticed you after strangers started applauding. The voicemails were a study in discomfort. The first one was short, just my name, spoken softly, like he wasn't sure it belonged to me anymore. The second one came later in the day, a little more desperate, asking if we could talk, just talk, nothing serious. The third was worse. He said he'd seen the video, that he didn't know, that he'd had no idea it was that bad, that I had felt that way, that I'd been so alone. As if the absence of his presence hadn't been blaring through every quiet family dinner and skipped event like a siren. As if the fact that I never once heard him say, "I'm proud of you," didn't scream its own kind of betrayal. I turned off my phone by lunch. But later that night, Josh showed up. No warning, no text, no knock. Just the low hum of his truck in the driveway, and the sound of his boots hitting the front steps like they owned the place, like he still thought he was the sun around which the rest of us orbited. I opened the door before he could ring the bell, mostly because I didn't want the neighbors hearing whatever scene he was about to drag onto my porch. He looked older than I remembered, softer around the edges, like someone who used to be made of stone but had started to erode slowly without realizing it. He had that same crooked half-smile he always used when he was trying to be charming and defuse tension, but it landed flat, because I wasn't the kid sister anymore, and he wasn't the golden boy who could laugh his way out of anything. "I saw the video," he said, like it was news to me, like the whole damn town hadn't seen it already. I didn't say anything, just crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe, waiting. "Dad's not doing great," he continued, and I could see how much it pained him to say even that much. "He's been up all night, watching it over and over. Says he didn't know." "He knew," I said, and it came out sharper than I expected, almost like a slap. "He just didn't care." Josh flinched, just slightly, and looked down at his shoes like he was examining them for answers. "You don't get it," he muttered. "He wasn't raised to talk about things. He thought if he stayed out of your way, you'd be fine." "He stayed out of my way so well he didn't even know what direction I was running in," I snapped, and for a second, I thought he might fire back. But he didn't. He just sighed, heavy and worn, and looked up at me with eyes that weren't angry, just tired. "He's trying now." And maybe that was the part that pissed me off the most. The idea that trying now was supposed to mean something. That a few calls and a night of guilt could erase the decades where I sat on bleachers by myself, tied my own spikes, limped home after races without so much as a nod of acknowledgement. That trying now was supposed to be enough to make me forget the years I spent carving out an identity in a house that only had space for one trophy, and it already had Josh's name on it. "I don't want an apology," I said finally, stepping back inside and gripping the door like it was the only thing keeping me from screaming. "I just want him to sit in what he missed. Let him feel what it's like to want something so badly and be met with silence." Josh didn't follow me in. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking like a man who'd lost a game he didn't know he was playing. I closed the door on him without saying goodbye. Later that night, After the house had gone still and the echoes of Josh's truck had long faded, I stared at the ceiling in my dark bedroom, phone in hand, thumb hovering over the callback button like it might burn me. I didn't want to call him, but I also didn't want to keep living in the same silence he had built for me brick by brick. So I did it. I called him. The phone rang once, twice, and then he answered, his voice small and unsteady. "Pumpkin?" And for the first time in years, I had no idea what to say. Because even though I had been preparing this confrontation in my head for most of my life, rehearsing it like a script I could recite in my sleep, now that it was real, now that he was there on the other end of the line, breathing and waiting, I realized I didn't want to fight, I wanted the truth. But I wasn't sure if he was ready to give it to me. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear it. There's a strange heaviness that settles in your chest when the thing you've been waiting for finally arrives, not because it brings joy or closure or clarity, but because it arrives so late and so far removed from when it might have mattered that all it really does is confirm what you already knew, that some absences are not accidental, and some silences are not just oversights but choices. And when the apology finally lands, it does so in the ruins, not to rebuild, but to whisper through the ashes. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, his voice still small and tentative on the other end, saying that name he hadn't used since I was 10, back when I still thought I could earn his attention with perfect grades and polite silence, and for a moment, I almost let it soften me, almost let it carve out a piece of that old, hopeful little girl that used to exist before the walls went up and the running began. But then the moment passed, and I remembered where I was, who I had become, and how far I had come without ever once hearing that name spoken with real love behind it. He said pumpkin like it was a key to something locked long ago, like that one word could undo decades of ignoring, as though calling me something sweet now might somehow excuse all the years he couldn't look me in the eye while Josh basked in the floodlights of his attention. And I'll admit, for a fraction of a breath, I didn't say anything, because I wanted to see what he would do without my voice guiding him. I wanted to hear what he sounded like when he had to stand there in the silence he had always been so comfortable letting me drown in. Then he spoke again, fumbling, reaching, trying to bridge the chasm with apologies that felt so painfully rehearsed I wondered if he'd been practicing them in the mirror since the video went viral. He said he didn't know how much I had been hurting. He said he never meant to make me feel invisible. He said things were different back then, that he thought being hard on me would make me stronger, and that he always believed in me, even if he didn't say it out loud. And I let him talk. Not because I believed a single word of it, but because I needed to hear him admit what he'd done, even if it came wrapped in excuses and revisionist history. I told him I didn't need his belief now. I told him I had built my strength not because of him, but in spite of him, and that while I understood his guilt, I wasn't about to mop up the mess he had made of our relationship just because the world had finally seen what he never bothered to look at. He tried to say he was proud of me, his voice cracking with what I think he hoped would sound like sincerity, but it only made my grip on the phone tighten, because hearing that word, proud, from a mouth that had stayed shut through every broken personal record and lonely podium felt like salt poured into an old, surgically stitched wound. I told him that being proud of someone means showing up when it matters, not sending a voicemail after the fact. That love is not measured by what you feel silently in your heart, but by what you do when someone is watching and, more importantly, when they're not. And I could hear it then, the shift, the quiet devastation in his breath, as if he had finally realized this wasn't a conversation he could fix by crying or confessing, that this was the reckoning he had avoided for over 20 years. And it had arrived not with screaming or blame, but with calm, articulate finality. He asked me what I wanted, whether there was anything he could do to make it right, to move forward, to be part of my life again. And that was the moment, the true moment, where the power tilted, because for the first time in my entire life, I was the one in control of the narrative, and he was the one asking for entrance into a story that had moved on without him. I told him I didn't want anything, that I had already won, with or without him. That the race was over and the silence had already spoken louder than any applause or late-night phone call ever could. And when he didn't say anything for several seconds, I knew he was absorbing it, Not just the words, but the full weight of what he'd lost. Not just a daughter, but the right to be proud of her out loud. But before I hung up, I paused. Not out of cruelty, not to twist the knife, but to leave him with the truth that I knew would linger long after the line went dead. I said, "Imagine what I could have been if I had a dad." Then I hung up. And I sat in that silence, the very same kind he once used, like armor, like a tool, like a shield between him and the hard parts of parenting, and I felt it differently this time. It wasn't empty. It wasn't cold. It was mine. I had taken it back. I had turned the echo of absence into something solid, something that couldn't be twisted or denied or explained away. In the days that followed, people kept calling, messaging, tagging me in posts, saying how brave I was, how powerful the speech had been, how they saw themselves in my story. Strangers. Friends from years ago. Teachers who once thought I was too quiet to lead. Even Coach D stopped me during a cool-down jog and said, without preamble, "You said the thing most people spend a lifetime swallowing. That takes guts." But I wasn't trying to be brave. I wasn't trying to start a movement or go viral or inspire anyone. I just got tired of waiting. Tired of hoping the people I loved would one day love me in return with the same fire. And when they didn't, I made peace with the idea that my strength had to come from elsewhere. There's a finality in saying what you've always needed to say, but there's also something deeply unresolved about it, because even though the truth is out in the open now, and even though the people who ignored it can't unhear it, that doesn't mean they'll change. That doesn't mean the damage gets undone. It just means the silence doesn't own you anymore. And maybe that's the best I can hope for, not reconciliation, not repair, but release. Because some stories don't have redemptive endings. Some just have the moment where the hero stops waiting to be saved and says out loud, for everyone to hear, that she saved herself. And that has to be enough. Whether they ever understand or not.